Sarah Martinez walked through the gates of Naval Station Norfolk with the same confident stride that had carried her through 8 years of classified missions across 3 continents. At 29, she possessed the lean, athletic build of someone who had spent countless hours in brutal training environments, though nothing about her casual civilian clothes suggested the lethal skills she carried beneath her quiet exterior. The transition back to civilian life hadn't been easy. After leaving the Navy SEALs 6 months earlier, Sarah found herself struggling with the mundane routines of ordinary existence. The adrenaline rush of high-stakes operations had been replaced by job interviews, apartment hunting, and the strange challenge of explaining her military background without revealing the classified nature of her service. Most people assumed she had served in some administrative capacity when she mentioned her Navy background. It was easier to let them believe that than to correct their assumptions. Today, she was visiting the base one final time to complete her transition paperwork and collect some personal items she had left in storage. The familiar sounds and smells of military life washed over her as she made her way across the compound. Everything seemed smaller somehow, less intimidating than it had during her early days as a recruit over a decade ago. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the training facilities where she had first learned to push her body and mind beyond what she thought possible. Those early days felt like a lifetime ago now. She had been one of only 3 women in her SEAL training class, and the only one to complete the full program. The statistics weren't encouraging for female candidates, but Sarah had never been deterred by statistics. Her phone buzzed with a text from her younger sister Emma, reminding her about dinner plans later that evening. Emma was a kindergarten teacher in nearby Virginia Beach, living the kind of normal, predictable life that Sarah sometimes envied. Emma's biggest daily challenge was managing 25 energetic 5-year-olds, a task that required its own special kind of endurance and tactical thinking. As Sarah approached the administrative building, she noticed 4 young men in recruit uniforms gathered near the entrance. They appeared to be taking a break from whatever training exercise had brought them to this part of the base. She recognized the look in their eyes, that mixture of nervous energy and bravado that came with being new to military life and eager to prove themselves. The recruits were engaged in animated conversation, their voices carrying across the quiet courtyard. From what Sarah could overhear, they were discussing weekend plans and complaining about various aspects of their training regimen. Their conversation had the casual, slightly cocky tone of young men who believed they were tougher than they actually were. One of them, a tall blonde recruit with the kind of swagger that usually indicated insecurity rather than confidence, noticed Sarah approaching. He nudged his companions and said something that made them all turn to look in her direction. Sarah had experienced enough unwanted attention from overconfident military personnel to recognize the shift in their demeanor immediately. She kept walking toward the building entrance, maintaining her purposeful stride and avoiding eye contact. In her experience, the best way to handle situations like this was to project confidence while avoiding any behavior that might be interpreted as confrontational. She had learned long ago that her appearance often caused people to make assumptions about her capabilities and personality, assumptions that were usually wildly inaccurate. The blonde recruit stepped away from his group and positioned himself directly in Sarah's path. His 3 companions spread out slightly, creating a loose semicircle that would make it difficult for her to continue toward the building without acknowledging their presence. It was a classic intimidation tactic, probably unconscious on their part, but effective nonetheless. "Excuse me, miss," the blonde recruit said with an exaggerated politeness that barely concealed his underlying arrogance. "I don't think I've seen you around here before. Are you lost? This is a military installation, you know." Sarah stopped walking and assessed the situation quickly. The 4 recruits were blocking her path to the administrative building, clearly intending to engage her in conversation whether she wanted to participate or not. Their body language suggested they viewed this as some kind of game or entertainment, an opportunity to demonstrate their perceived superiority over a civilian woman who had wandered onto their territory. "I'm not lost," Sarah replied calmly, keeping her voice level and professional. "I have business in the administrative building." The second recruit, a stocky young man with close-cropped dark hair and an aggressive jaw, stepped closer. "What kind of business would a civilian have here? You sure you're in the right place, sweetheart?" The condescending tone and the unwelcome endearment triggered a familiar surge of irritation in Sarah's chest, but she maintained her composure. These recruits had no idea who they were dealing with, and she saw no reason to enlighten them unless the situation escalated beyond mere rudeness. "I'm completing some paperwork," she said, attempting to step around the group. "Now if you'll excuse me, I'd like to get this finished before the office closes." The third recruit, a lean young man with nervous energy and darting eyes, moved to block her alternate route. "Hold on there, ma'am. We can't just let random people wander around the base without proper identification. Security protocol, you understand." Sarah recognized the tactic immediately. These recruits were using official-sounding language to justify what was essentially harassment. They had no authority to detain or question her, and they almost certainly knew it. This was about asserting dominance and having some fun at the expense of someone they perceived as vulnerable. The fourth member of the group, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. He was shorter than his companions but carried himself with the kind of aggressive confidence that often compensated for physical limitations. "Maybe we should escort her to the proper authorities," he suggested with a smirk. "Make sure she gets where she needs to go safely." The suggestion carried an implicit threat that wasn't lost on Sarah. These four recruits were essentially proposing to detain her under the pretense of security concerns. It was a power play, pure and simple, designed to make her feel helpless and dependent on their questionable protection. Sarah had encountered similar situations countless times during her military career, though usually in much more dangerous circumstances and foreign locations. The fundamental dynamic was always the same: individuals using perceived authority or physical intimidation to control others. The difference was that in combat zones, the stakes were life and death. Here, the stakes were merely her time and dignity. She took a deep breath and made a decision. These recruits needed to learn a lesson about making assumptions, and she was in a position to provide that education. However, she would give them one final opportunity to reconsider their approach. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice taking on a slightly harder edge, "I appreciate your concern for base security, but I assure you that I have every right to be here. I'm going to walk to that building now, and I'd prefer not to have this conversation continue." The blonde recruit laughed and exchanged glances with his companions. "Oh, would you prefer that? Well, that's very nice, but we're not really asking what you'd prefer. We're telling you how this is going to work." His tone had shifted from mock politeness to open aggression, and Sarah realized that these young men had moved beyond simple harassment into something more serious. They were now actively attempting to intimidate and control her, behavior that crossed several lines both legally and morally. The stocky recruit stepped even closer, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly intended to make her uncomfortable. "You seem a little too confident for someone in your position, sweetheart. Maybe we need to help you understand how things work around here." Sarah felt the familiar calm that had served her through countless dangerous situations settling over her consciousness. Her breathing slowed, her muscles relaxed, and her awareness of her surroundings became crystal clear. She could see the exact positioning of all four recruits, the distances between them, and the potential escape routes if the situation continued to deteriorate. "My position?" she asked quietly, genuinely curious about how these young men perceived her circumstances. "Yeah, your position," the lean recruit said with growing confidence. "One woman, four of us, nobody around to help you, on our turf. Maybe you should be a little more cooperative and grateful that we're being so nice about this." The implicit threat was now explicit, and Sarah realized that these recruits had fundamentally misunderstood both the situation and her capabilities. They saw a lone woman who could be easily intimidated and controlled. They had no idea that they were dealing with someone who had spent years training for exactly these kinds of confrontational scenarios. The shorter recruit moved to her left side, completing the encirclement. "So here's what's going to happen," he said with obvious satisfaction. "You're going to come with us, and we're going to have a little conversation about respect and appropriate behavior on military property." Sarah looked around the group slowly, making eye contact with each recruit in turn. She saw the same expression on all their faces, the confident anticipation of young men who believed they were about to assert their dominance over someone weaker than themselves. It was an expression she had seen many times before, usually right before those same confident individuals discovered how badly they had misjudged their situation.
Before we continue, Sarah said calmly, I want to make sure I understand what you're proposing. You four are planning to physically detain me and take me somewhere against my will, is that correct? The blonde recruit's smile widened. We're planning to escort you to the appropriate authorities so they can deal with your trespassing. What happens after that depends on how cooperative you decide to be. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. I see. And you've made this decision based on your assessment that I'm just a helpless civilian woman who can't defend herself against four big, strong military men. That's about the size of it, sweetheart, the stocky recruit said with obvious pleasure. Nothing personal, but you picked the wrong place to wander around acting like you own the joint. Sarah's response was so quiet that the recruits had to lean forward to hear her clearly. Gentlemen, you have made a very significant error in judgment. The words hung in the air for a moment, and Sarah could see confusion beginning to creep into their expressions. Her tone had changed completely, shifting from civilian politeness to something much harder and more dangerous. For the first time since the encounter began, the recruits seemed to sense that something about their assumed narrative might be incorrect. But their momentum was too strong, and their investment in the confrontation too complete, for them to reconsider their approach. The blonde recruit stepped forward and reached out to grab Sarah's arm, clearly intending to begin the physical phase of their intimidation campaign. That was the moment when everything changed. The transformation in Sarah Martinez was instantaneous and complete. Years of combat training activated in the space between heartbeats, muscle memory taking control as her conscious mind shifted into the tactical mode that had kept her alive through dozens of life-threatening situations. The recruits had crossed the line from verbal harassment to physical assault, and Sarah's response reflected that escalation. When the blonde recruit's hand moved toward her arm, Sarah's body reacted with fluid precision. She stepped slightly to her left, rotating her torso to avoid his grasp while simultaneously bringing her right hand up in a defensive position. Her movement was economical and controlled, designed to neutralize the immediate threat while maintaining her balance and positioning for whatever came next. The recruit's momentum carried him forward into empty space where Sarah had been standing a fraction of a second earlier. His confident expression shifted to confusion as he realized his target had somehow evaded his grasp with minimal apparent effort. He stumbled slightly, caught off balance by his own aggressive movement and the unexpected absence of resistance. What the hell, he muttered, turning to face Sarah again with growing irritation and embarrassment. The stocky recruit moved to support his companion, clearly intending to use their numerical advantage to overwhelm what they still perceived as helpless opposition. He approached from Sarah's right side, arms spread wide in an attempt to grab her in some kind of bear hug that would immobilize her while his friends decided what to do next. Sarah's counter was swift and devastating. As the stocky recruit reached for her, she dropped her weight slightly and drove her left elbow backward into his solar plexus with precise force. The blow landed exactly where she intended it, driving the air from his lungs and doubling him over in sudden, gasping pain. Before he could recover, Sarah spun to face him and delivered a controlled palm strike to his chest that sent him stumbling backward into one of his companions. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds, and suddenly, the dynamic of the confrontation had shifted dramatically. 2 of the 4 recruits were disabled or disoriented, and the remaining 2 were staring at Sarah with expressions of shock and growing alarm. How did she do that? The lean recruit asked his remaining companion, his voice carrying a note of panic that hadn't been there moments before. Sarah maintained her defensive stance, her breathing still calm and controlled despite the sudden burst of physical activity. Her eyes moved constantly between the 4 recruits, tracking their positions and anticipating their next moves. The skills that had made her an effective SEAL operator were fully engaged now, and she found herself analyzing the tactical situation with the same cold professionalism she had applied to combat zones. The blonde recruit had recovered from his initial confusion and was now approaching her with more caution, clearly recognizing that his assumptions about her capabilities had been incorrect. His swagger had been replaced by wariness, but his pride and anger prevented him from backing down entirely. "You got lucky with that cheap shot," he said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. "But there are still 4 of us and 1 of you. The math hasn't changed." Sarah almost smiled at the statement. The math had changed completely,
but these recruits lacked the experience to recognize how fundamentally their situation had deteriorated. They still saw numbers and assumed that quantity would overcome quality, a mistake that had proven fatal for countless opponents throughout military history. The shorter recruit was helping his stocky companion recover from Sarah's elbow strike, both of them now maintaining a more respectful distance from her position. The stocky recruit was still breathing heavily, his face flushed with pain and humiliation. He looked like he wanted to charge at Sarah in anger, but something in her posture and readiness convinced him to reconsider that impulse.
"This is insane," the lean recruit said to his companions. "She's just some civilian. How is she doing this?"
Sarah decided it was time to provide some clarity about the situation, both for their education and to potentially de-escalate the confrontation before it went any further. These young men were making dangerous assumptions that could result in serious injuries if they continued on their current course. "Gentlemen, you need to understand something important," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed under stressful circumstances. "I am not just some civilian, and this situation is not what you think it is." The blonde recruit shook his head stubbornly. "I don't care what kind of martial arts classes you took at the local community center. We're trained military personnel, and you're trespassing on our base." The fundamental ignorance of his statement would have been amusing under different circumstances. These recruits had perhaps 6 months of basic military training, most of it focused on discipline, physical conditioning, and elementary combat skills. They had no real combat experience and no understanding of what actual military expertise looked like when applied with lethal intent. Sarah had spent 8 years in the most elite special operations unit in the American military. She had undergone training that pushed human physical and mental capabilities to their absolute limits. She had applied those skills in real combat situations where failure meant death not just for her, but for her teammates and the innocent people they were protecting. The gulf between her capabilities and theirs was so vast that it might as well have been the difference between a professional athlete and a weekend jogger. But explaining that to these recruits would require revealing information about her service record that remained classified. The nature of SEAL operations meant that many details of her career would never be public knowledge, even after her retirement from active duty. She could not simply tell them who she was and expect them to understand the implications. The lean recruit seemed to be the most intelligent of the group, and Sarah could see him beginning to reconsider the wisdom of their confrontation. His eyes were moving between Sarah's relaxed but ready posture and his injured companion, clearly trying to process information that didn't fit his preconceived notions about the situation. "Maybe we should just let base security handle this," he suggested to his friends. "Call the MPs and let them sort it out." It was the first sensible suggestion any of them had made, and Sarah felt a brief moment of hope that the situation might be resolved without further violence. Involving the military police would quickly clarify her right to be on the base and end the harassment she had been enduring. Unfortunately, the blonde recruit's pride was too wounded for him to accept such a reasonable resolution. He had initiated this confrontation with the expectation of easy dominance over a helpless target, and the actual results had humiliated him in front of his peers. His ego demanded some kind of victory to restore his damaged self-image. "No way," he said firmly. "She attacked us. She's dangerous, and we need to subdue her before she hurts someone else." Sarah recognized the dangerous shift in his reasoning. The recruit was now reframing her defensive actions as unprovoked attacks, creating a narrative that justified escalated aggression on his part. It was a classic psychological defense mechanism, allowing him to maintain his self-image as the victim rather than the aggressor. The stocky recruit had recovered enough to speak, though he was still breathing hard from Sarah's elbow strike. "She hit me when I wasn't ready," he said angrily. "That's assault on military personnel. We have to take her down." The shorter recruit nodded enthusiastically, clearly eager to restore the group's sense of dominance and control. "She's obviously some kind of terrorist or spy. Normal people don't fight like that." Sarah realized with growing concern that the recruits were working themselves into a state where they would feel justified in using serious violence against her. Their wounded pride and inability to admit their mistake were creating a dangerous escalation that could result in significant injuries for all involved. she made one final attempt to reason with them. "Listen carefully," she said, her voice taking on the commanding tone she had used to lead troops in combat situations.
"You are making a serious error. I am not a threat to base security. I am not a terrorist or a spy. I am a former Navy SEAL who came here to complete administrative paperwork, and I have every right to be on this installation." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Sarah could see the recruits processing what she had just revealed. The lean recruit's eyes widened with sudden understanding, and he took an involuntary step backward as the implications of her statement became clear. But the other three recruits reacted with skepticism and increased anger. The idea that a woman could be a Navy SEAL contradicted everything they thought they knew about military hierarchies and capabilities. Rather than accepting information that challenged their worldview, they rejected it entirely. "That's impossible," the blonde recruit said with conviction. "Women aren't SEALs. You're lying to try to get out of trouble. Even if it were possible, which it isn't, you don't look anything like a SEAL," the stocky recruit added. "SEALs are huge, intimidating guys. You're just a normal-looking woman trying to play tough." Their response revealed the depth of their ignorance about special operations and the nature of effective combat personnel. These recruits had absorbed Hollywood stereotypes about military elite units, imagining SEALs as impossibly muscled action heroes rather than the highly trained, tactically sophisticated operators they actually were. Sarah realized that further conversation was pointless. These young men had invested too much emotional energy in their initial assumptions to accept contradictory information, no matter how factual. They would continue escalating until she was forced to demonstrate exactly why their assumptions were dangerous. The shorter recruit was moving to flank her again, clearly coordinating with his companions for another simultaneous attack. They had learned enough from their first attempt to approach her with more caution, but not enough to recognize that they were fundamentally outclassed in every relevant skill. "Last warning," Sarah said quietly. "Walk away now, and we can all pretend this never happened. Continue this confrontation, and you will be seriously injured." The blonde recruit's response was to signal his companions for a coordinated rush. All four recruits moved toward Sarah simultaneously, apparently believing that overwhelming speed and numbers would compensate for their demonstrated tactical inferiority. Sarah's response was a masterpiece of combat efficiency. As the four recruits converged on her position, she moved with fluid grace between their attacking lines, using their own momentum and aggression against them in ways that transformed their coordinated assault into a chaotic collision of bodies and confusion. The lean recruit, who had been approaching from her left, found himself grasping empty air as Sarah pivoted smoothly away from his position. Her movement brought her directly into the path of the shorter recruit, who was charging from the opposite direction. Sarah's response was a perfectly executed hip throw that used his own forward momentum to send him tumbling across the concrete courtyard. Before the other two recruits could adjust to her new position, Sarah had already moved again. The blonde recruit's grabbing hands found nothing but empty space, and his overcommitted lunge carried him directly into his stocky companion, who was still moving to intercept Sarah's previous location. In the space of 5 seconds, the recruit's coordinated attack had dissolved into complete chaos. Two of them were on the ground, one was tangled up with his companion, and the fourth was spinning around trying to locate their impossibly elusive target. Sarah stood a few feet away from the confusion, her breathing still calm and controlled, watching as the recruits struggled to reorient themselves. The demonstration of her capabilities was now complete, and she waited to see if they had finally learned the lesson she had been trying to teach them. The aftermath of Sarah's defensive demonstration left the four recruits in various states of confusion, pain, and dawning realization. The shorter recruit was slowly picking himself up from the concrete, his face a mixture of bewilderment and growing respect. The lean recruit stood frozen in place, his eyes wide with the kind of shock that comes from witnessing something that completely contradicts your understanding of reality. The stocky recruit and the blonde leader were untangling themselves from their collision, both breathing heavily and moving with the careful deliberation of people who had suddenly realized they might be seriously outmatched. The confident swagger that had characterized their initial approach had been completely replaced by wariness and uncertainty. Sarah maintained her ready position, observing their reactions and calculating whether additional defensive measures might be necessary.
Her experience in combat zones had taught her that wounded pride could be just as dangerous as active aggression, sometimes more so because it was unpredictable and emotionally driven rather than tactically sound. The courtyard around them remained empty of other personnel, a fact that both concerned and relieved Sarah. She was grateful that their confrontation hadn't attracted an audience that might complicate the situation, but she also recognized that the isolation meant no outside intervention would occur if the recruits decided to escalate further. The lean recruit was the first to speak, his voice carrying a note of genuine awe that hadn't been present in any of their previous interactions.
"How did you do that? I mean, seriously, how is that even possible?"
His question represented the first crack in the group's collective certainty about the situation. Sarah could see him beginning to process the implications of what he had just witnessed, his military training finally overcoming his preconceived notions about gender and combat capability. The shorter recruit was dusting himself off, moving gingerly as he tested various parts of his body for injury. Sarah's throw had been controlled and precise, designed to neutralize his attack without causing permanent damage, but it had certainly been forceful enough to make an impression. "I think I might have underestimated something here," he admitted quietly, looking at Sarah with a new kind of respect. "That wasn't luck, and it wasn't some community center self-defense class." The stocky recruit was still breathing hard, one hand pressed against his chest where Sarah's palm strike had landed. He looked like he wanted to continue the fight, but his body was providing compelling evidence that such a decision would be unwise.
"This doesn't make sense," he said, though his tone was more confused than angry now. You look so normal. How are you doing this to us?"
Sarah recognized the cognitive dissonance they were experiencing. These young men had been raised in a culture that associated physical dominance with obvious visual indicators like size, muscle mass, and aggressive posturing. The idea that lethal combat skills could be contained within someone who looked like an ordinary woman challenged fundamental assumptions about strength and capability. The blonde recruit was the last to speak, and his words revealed that his pride was still struggling with the reality of what had occurred.
"This isn't over," he said, though his voice lacked conviction.
"I don't care what kind of tricks you know. We're still military personnel, and you're still a civilian trespasser."
Sarah almost felt sorry for him.
His entire self-image was built around being tough, dominant, and intimidating, particularly toward people he perceived as weaker than himself. Accepting that a woman had effortlessly neutralized his best efforts would require him to fundamentally reassess his understanding of his own capabilities and place in the world. But his continued defiance also represented a potential danger. Wounded pride could drive people to increasingly desperate and reckless actions, especially when they felt their fundamental identity was being challenged.
"You're right about one thing," Sarah said calmly.
"You are military personnel, and that means you've sworn an oath to protect people, not to harass and intimidate them."
"You've forgotten what that uniform is supposed to represent."
Her words carried the weight of someone who had lived that oath under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Sarah had seen military personnel at their best and worst, had witnessed acts of incredible heroism and devastating moral failure, and she understood better than most what it meant to wear the uniform with honor.
The lean recruit was nodding slowly, his expression showing genuine shame for the first time since the confrontation began.
"She's right," he said to his companions. "We screwed up here. We let our egos get in the way of doing the right thing."
"The right thing," the blonde recruit demanded. "She attacked us. She's dangerous."
Sarah decided it was time to provide more context for her actions, both to help them understand what had occurred and to potentially prevent similar situations in the future. These recruits needed to learn from this experience, not just nurse their wounded pride. "I didn't attack anyone," she said firmly. "Every move I made was defensive, designed to neutralize attempts to physically assault me. You four initiated contact, escalated to physical confrontation, and continued aggressive action even after I warned you to stop. My responses were measured and controlled specifically to avoid causing serious injury." The shorter recruit was examining his arms and legs, checking for damage from his encounter with the concrete courtyard. "She's right," he said reluctantly. "I rushed at her, and she just redirected me. If she had wanted to hurt me seriously, she could have." The realization was clearly uncomfortable for him, but it represented an important step toward understanding the true nature of their situation. Sarah had indeed been remarkably restrained in her responses, using just enough force to neutralize their attacks without causing permanent damage. The stocky recruit was beginning to accept the evidence of his own experience. "When she hit me, it was exactly where it would disable me without doing real damage," he admitted.
"That's not luck or accident. That's training and skill."
Sarah could see the group dynamic beginning to shift as individual members started to acknowledge the reality of what had occurred. The collective delusion that had sustained their aggressive behavior was breaking down as each recruit was forced to confront evidence that contradicted their shared assumptions.
But the blonde recruit remained resistant to these revelations.
His position as the group's informal leader meant that accepting Sarah's superiority would represent a particularly devastating blow to his status among his peers. "I don't care what kind of training she claims to have," he said stubbornly. "The fact remains that she's a civilian on a military base, and we have authority here that she doesn't." Sarah recognized that he was retreating to the one area where he felt he might still maintain some advantage. Military hierarchy and protocol were concepts he understood, unlike the tactical realities of combat that had just been demonstrated so convincingly.
"Actually, you don't have any authority over me," Sarah replied calmly. "You're recruits in basic training.
Your authority extends to following orders and completing your assigned duties, not to detaining and interrogating people you encounter on base."
The lean recruit was nodding in agreement. "She's right about that too. We don't have any official security responsibilities. We were just showing off, I guess."
His admission represented a breakthrough in honesty that Sarah hoped would spread to his companions. Acknowledging their true motivations was essential for learning from this experience and avoiding similar mistakes in the future. The shorter recruit was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the group's position. "Maybe we should apologize and just let her go about her business," he suggested. This whole thing got way out of hand. It was a reasonable suggestion, and Sarah felt encouraged that at least some of the recruits were beginning to recognize the inappropriate nature of their behavior. But she also knew that simply walking away without addressing the underlying issues would miss an important teaching opportunity. "Before we end this," she said, "I want you to understand something important. What happened here today was the result of making assumptions based on appearance, gender, and perceived vulnerability. Those assumptions almost led to serious consequences for all of you." The recruits were listening now with a level of attention they hadn't shown during the initial confrontation. The demonstration of her capabilities had earned their respect in a way that words alone never could have accomplished. "In military operations, those kinds of assumptions can get people killed," Sarah continued. "The enemy you underestimate, the situation you misjudge, the capabilities you dismiss, any of these can lead to mission failure and casualties." The blonde recruit was struggling with the implications of her words, but even he seemed to be beginning to understand that this encounter represented more than just a personal defeat. It was a lesson in tactical thinking and situational awareness that could have broader applications to their military careers.
The stocky recruit asked the question that was clearly on all their minds. "Are you really a Navy SEAL? I mean, is that actually possible?" Sarah considered how much information she could safely share.
The basic facts of women serving in special operations were no longer classified, though many details of specific operations and personnel remained restricted. "Women have been serving in special operations roles for several years now," she said. "The military has recognized that gender is less important than capability when it comes to mission effectiveness." The lean recruit was processing this information with obvious fascination.
"So you really have combat experience? Real missions and everything?"
"I served 8 years in Navy Special Warfare," Sarah replied. "The details of specific operations remain classified, but, yes, I have extensive combat experience." The shorter recruit whistled softly.
"And we tried to intimidate you. Oh man, we are so lucky you didn't really hurt us."
Sarah smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. "You're all young and inexperienced, and you made mistakes based on ignorance rather than malice. Those are the kinds of mistakes people can learn from if they're willing to be honest about what happened." The group stood in awkward silence for a moment, each recruit processing the implications of their encounter with Sarah. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting longer shadows across the courtyard and reminding them that time was passing. Finally, the lean recruit stepped forward and extended his hand. "I want to apologize for our behavior today," he said formally. "We were wrong, and we're sorry for treating you disrespectfully." Sarah shook his hand, appreciating the gesture of respect and reconciliation. One by one, the other recruits followed suit, including the shorter and stocky recruits who offered their own apologies. The blonde recruit was the last to approach, and Sarah could see that his pride was still struggling with the reality of the situation. But, to his credit, he eventually extended his hand as well. "I still don't completely understand what happened here today," he said quietly. "But I can see that I was wrong about you, and I'm sorry for the way I behaved." Sarah accepted his apology with the same grace she had shown the others, recognizing that admitting error had been particularly difficult for him given his personality and the public nature of his defeat. As the recruits began to disperse, the lean recruit lingered for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "What would have happened if we had kept fighting? I mean, if we had really tried to hurt you?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "You would have been seriously injured," she said simply. "I was being very careful to use minimal force because I recognized that you were young and inexperienced. In a real threat situation, my response would have been very different." The recruit nodded soberly, clearly understanding the implications of her statement. "Thank you for showing restraint," he said. "And thank you for the lesson. I won't forget what I learned today." As the recruits walked away from the courtyard, Sarah finally continued toward the administrative building to complete the paperwork that had brought her to the base in the first place. The encounter had delayed her by nearly 30 minutes, but she felt that the educational value for those young men made the time worthwhile. The administrative office was nearly empty at this late hour, with only a single clerk remaining to process final requests before closing time. Sarah presented her identification and explained the nature of her visit, watching as the clerk's demeanor shifted from routine professionalism to genuine respect when he reviewed her service record. "Ma'am, it's an honor to assist you with your transition paperwork," he said formally. "Your service record is quite impressive, though I notice much of it is classified above my clearance level." Sarah nodded, accustomed to the way her military record appeared to personnel without appropriate security clearances. The nature of special operations meant that many aspects of her career would remain permanently redacted from public view, appearing as blank spaces and coded references that hinted at significant activities without revealing operational details. The paperwork process was straightforward but time-consuming, involving verification of various benefits, transfer of medical records, and completion of final security clearances. As she worked through the forms, Sarah found herself reflecting on the 8 years of service that these documents represented. Her career had taken her to conflicts and crisis situations around the world, often in circumstances where the stakes were measured in lives saved or lost rather than simple mission objectives. She had worked alongside some of the most capable and dedicated professionals in the American military, forming bonds of trust and mutual respect that transcended conventional social boundaries. The transition to civilian life had been more challenging than she had anticipated. The intensity and purpose of military service, particularly in special operations, created a clarity of mission that was difficult to replicate in ordinary civilian employment. Sarah often found herself missing not just the adrenaline of high-stakes operations, but the sense of serving something larger than herself. Her phone buzzed with another message from her sister Emma, this one asking if she was still planning to join the family for dinner. Sarah realized that her encounter with the recruits had put her behind schedule, and she quickly sent back a response confirming that she was running late but would definitely be there. The clerk finished processing her paperwork and handed her a folder containing various certificates and documentation. "Ma'am, your service has been officially concluded, and your benefits are now transferred to veteran status," he said. "Is there anything else the Navy can do for you today?" Sarah smiled at the formal question. After 8 years of intensive service, the idea that her relationship with the Navy could be concluded with a single folder of paperwork felt both surreal and anticlimactic. But she recognized that institutional processes, however impersonal, served important functions in helping people transition between different phases of their lives.
"No, that covers everything," she replied. "Thank you for staying late to help me complete this."
As she walked back across the base toward the parking area, Sarah found herself thinking about the encounter with the 4 recruits. The incident had been frustrating and unnecessary, but it had also provided an unexpected opportunity to reflect on her own journey and the assumptions people made about capability and strength. The recruits had seen a woman of average height and build, dressed in civilian clothes, and had assumed she represented an easy target for intimidation and harassment. Their assumptions had been based on cultural stereotypes and limited experience rather than any actual assessment of her capabilities or background. In some ways, their mistake mirrored challenges that female service members faced throughout the military system. Despite decades of evidence demonstrating women's effectiveness in combat roles, many people still clung to outdated notions about gender and physical capability. Sarah had spent her entire career proving herself to skeptics who assumed that her success must be the result of lowered standards rather than exceptional performance. But the encounter had also demonstrated the power of actual experience over theoretical assumptions. The recruits' attitudes had changed completely once they witnessed evidence of her skills in action. Their respect, when it finally came, was based on demonstrated capability rather than mere assertions or credentials. As she reached her car, Sarah noticed that several other vehicles in the parking area contained personnel who appeared to be ending their duty shifts. The sight reminded her of countless similar moments throughout her career, the daily rhythm of military life with its mixture of routine duties and constant readiness for emergency deployment. She started her car and began the drive toward Virginia Beach, where Emma was waiting with a home-cooked meal and the kind of normal family conversation that Sarah was still learning to appreciate. The contrast between her afternoon's encounter and the evening's planned activities seemed to capture perfectly the strange duality of her current life situation. During the drive, Sarah found herself wondering what had become of the 4 recruits after their encounter. She hoped they would genuinely learn from the experience and apply those lessons to their future military service. Young service members who could recognize and correct their mistakes early in their careers often went on to become exceptional leaders and effective operators. The lean recruit, in particular, had shown promising signs of intellectual flexibility and genuine concern for appropriate behavior. His willingness to acknowledge error and ask thoughtful questions suggested the kind of character traits that could be developed into strong leadership capabilities with proper guidance and experience. Even the blonde recruit, despite his initial resistance to acknowledging error, had eventually managed to overcome his pride enough to offer an apology. That suggested an underlying capacity for growth that could serve him well if he continued to work on his judgment and decision-making skills. Sarah's phone rang as she was navigating through late afternoon traffic, and she answered using her car's hands-free system. Emma's voice filled the vehicle with characteristic warmth and energy. "Hey sis, Mom wanted me to ask if you prefer red wine or white wine with dinner. She's making her famous lasagna, and she wants to make sure everything is perfect for your visit." The question made Sarah smile. Her mother's attention to such details represented the kind of loving care that military life had rarely allowed time to appreciate. The contrast between her afternoon's demonstration of combat skills and her mother's concern about wine selection seemed to perfectly illustrate the complexity of her current transition period. "Either one is fine," Sarah replied. "Tell Mom I'm just grateful for a home-cooked meal and good company. The wine is just a bonus." "How did your paperwork stuff go today? Were you able to get everything finished?" Emma asked. Sarah considered how much detail to share about her afternoon's activities. Emma knew the general facts about her military service but remained somewhat innocent about the specific nature of special operations work and the kinds of situations that training prepared people to handle. "It went fine," Sarah said eventually. "There was a minor delay, but I got everything completed. The transition is officially finished now." "That's great. So now you can focus completely on figuring out what comes next in your civilian career. Have you given any more thought to those job opportunities we discussed last week?" The question reminded Sarah that her immediate challenge involved finding meaningful civilian employment that could provide some of the purpose and satisfaction that military service had offered. Several companies had expressed interest in her background, particularly organizations that valued leadership experience and the ability to perform under pressure.
"I'm still considering the options," she said. "There are definitely some interesting possibilities, but I want to make sure I choose something that feels right for the long term." "Well, whatever you decide, we're all proud of you and excited to have you closer to home again.
It'll be nice to have family dinners on a regular basis instead of just during your brief leave periods." Emma's comment reminded Sarah of one of the most positive aspects of her transition to civilian life. Military service had required frequent deployments and assignments that kept her separated from family for extended periods. Now she would have the opportunity to maintain closer relationships with the people who mattered most to her. As she pulled into her parents' driveway, Sarah could see lights in the kitchen windows and could smell the aroma of her mother's cooking even before she got out of the car. The familiar sights and smells of home provided a comfortable contrast to the institutional environment of the military base she had just left. Emma met her at the front door with a characteristic hug that seemed to last longer than usual. "I'm so glad you're home safe," she said quietly. "I know I didn't always understand exactly what you were doing during your service, but I always worried about you." Sarah returned the hug, appreciating both the warmth and the underlying recognition of the risks her career had entailed. While her family had never known specific details about her missions and operations, they had understood enough about special operations work to recognize that her service involved genuine danger.
"I'm glad to be home too," she said honestly. "And I'm grateful for family who supported me even when they didn't completely understand what I was doing."
Her mother appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron and beaming with the kind of maternal pride that made Sarah feel simultaneously grateful and slightly embarrassed. "There's my daughter, the hero," she said, pulling Sarah into another warm embrace.
"Mom, I'm not a hero," Sarah protested gently.
"I was just doing my job, like thousands of other people in the military. Doing your job in some of the most dangerous places in the world, protecting people who will never even know your name," her mother replied firmly. "That sounds like heroism to me, regardless of what you call it." The conversation continued over dinner, with Sarah's family asking careful questions about her transition plans and offering various forms of support and encouragement. They seemed to understand intuitively that she needed time to process the changes in her life without pressure to make immediate decisions about her future direction. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself gradually relaxing into the comfortable rhythms of family interaction. The contrast with her afternoon's encounter at the base was striking. Here she was appreciated and valued for who she was rather than being judged by superficial assumptions about her appearance or capabilities. Later that night, as she prepared for bed in her childhood room, Sarah reflected on the day's events and their broader significance. The encounter with the recruits had been a reminder of the challenges that people faced when their assumptions about the world were confronted by contradictory evidence. But it had also been a reminder of her own capabilities and the value of the training she had received during her military career. The skills that had kept her alive in combat zones remained available to her in civilian life, even if she hoped never to need them in such dramatic circumstances again. Most importantly, the day had reinforced her growing understanding that the transition from military to civilian life was not simply about finding new employment or learning to navigate different social environments. It was about integrating the person she had become through military service with the civilian life she was now choosing to build. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah felt grateful for both the challenges and the opportunities that lay ahead. Her encounter with the recruits had reminded her that she carried valuable lessons and capabilities that could benefit others, even in civilian contexts. Perhaps her future would involve finding ways to share those lessons and help others avoid the kinds of assumptions and mistakes that could lead to dangerous situations. The last thought in her mind before sleep was a simple recognition that every ending also represented a beginning, and that her story was far from over. The skills, experiences, and wisdom she had gained during her military service would continue to shape her contributions to society, even as she learned to navigate the different challenges and opportunities that civilian life would present. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, and Sarah was ready to meet them with the same courage, competence, and commitment that had carried her through 8 years of military service in some of the world's most challenging environments.